All right, I think we've got a great group started here now, and why don't we go ahead and get started with the webinar. Thanks for joining us, everybody. We've put together some content here that I think you really enjoy, and we're going to run for approximately an hour. Today's webinar is titled 5 Best Practices for Implementing XDR. And just a few administration notes before we get started. Today's webinar is being recorded, and we'll be sure to send that recording out to everybody once we have it posted available. There's a Q&A area on your screen in the Zoom menu bar, so you can use this to send questions to the speakers. We'll save a little bit of time at the end, and we'll try to answer as many questions as we can from the group. So now I'd like to introduce our speakers for today's webinar. Raisha Chetta, she's the Director of Product Marketing at SentinelOne, and Michael Leland, the Chief Security Evangelist here at SentinelOne. So I'll hand it over to Raisha now. She's going to take us through the first few slides. Raisha, why don't you go for it?
You're on mute, Raisha.
All right, perfect. Thank you, Adam. And good evening, good morning, good afternoon from wherever you're joining us. Hope today is going to be exciting agenda for you. We're going to go over some of the challenges that security teams face today, current market situation, and then 5 best practices that you should follow as you're implementing your XDR solution. So with that, let's get started. So with the new attack vectors that a lot of security teams are facing and seeing, there are a lot of new challenges that people face. First is multi-vendor security stack. So if you look at the current endpoint current enterprise SOC footprint, you will find that security solutions in a typical SOC kind of constantly continue to grow. And along with it, the complexity of the solutions. So ESG recently reported that most mid to large-ish enterprise teams are faced with a challenge of mastering as many as 50 different tools from 10 or more vendors. And more often than not, these tools are in silo. They don't necessarily work well with each other. And all of this causes complexity, friction, and ultimately blind spots and visibility gaps in the environment. The second issue that we see is data overload, and that is the sheer number and volume of alerts that the security team has to deal with on a day-to-day basis. And overwhelming volumes of data make it really difficult for the SOC team to prioritize security efforts and prioritize response times. A recent survey done by IDC showed that as many as 25 alerts go untriaged, go uninvestigated, and a quarter of those are actually, in fact, very severe. So this means that on an average, 6% of critical security events are never even analyzed. And to make matters worse, we have continued to expand our data collection into multiple disconnected storage, making it very hard for the SOC team to understand what is happening at a macro level. So we often see repositories for third-party events traditionally stored in SIEM, another one for endpoint, another one for cloud, and so on, but with no connection amongst them. So this requires, in effect, security team to jump from one system to another to kind of piece the pieces of puzzle together, if you will. And this, as you can imagine, inevitably leads to wasting precious time, misdetection, and lack of context during triage and investigation process. And finally, detecting and remediating incidents is an extremely resource-intensive, time-consuming, and error-prone task, especially if it involves multiple tools and interfaces. To get to the bottom of an issue, Analysts are often forced to manually sift through and piece together large volumes of data generated by different systems, wasting precious, valuable analyst time that could have spent containing the attack, which ultimately kind of results in increased dwell time. And to be honest, if you look at it, you cannot easily solve this problem together by throwing more people or more human resource. And because, many of the SecOps teams admit that they suffer from an overwhelming skill shortage.
Thanks, Raisha. So I want to add to the mix that we've been calling this problem for a while, this challenge of too many consoles, too many interfaces. And what the vendor community has largely been promising you is something that we've all come to know as a single pane of glass, right? The SPOG. I would argue that many vendors are getting closer to the reality of a single pane of glass. I would say that in many respects, XDR helps to consolidate the user experience into a single workflow. It brings visibility into a single location, allows better triage, better threat hunting. But I would also claim that the vendor community has been selling you this for so long and never really delivered on the promise of a single pane of glass. In fact, I tend to argue that rather than a single pane of glass, the vendor community has been delivering you a single glass of paint, right? And that is that every console you have to learn, every new platform you onboard has its own learning curve. It requires a certain number of FTEs to onboard, to configure, to manually control and maintain. And I would argue that the bane of a SOC analyst's existence, in addition to things like alert fatigue, is really Control-C, Control-V, right? It's learning something in one console, having to copy it into your buffer, spin around in your chair, paste it somewhere else, and then continue your triage, your remediation, or your threat hunt in another tool, right? The challenge here is that we can't keep adding more tools, more consoles, and expecting our security operations teams to be as proficient as they need to get the job done. Now, what this also means is we've kind of come to expect a couple of things, and complexity is really the biggest challenge to security operations. And I like to put it this way. We've come to expect from the vendor community something like this, right? We all have a picture in our head of what the perfect scenario looks like, whether it's for defense or offense. We have an idea because we've been told that a platform will be entirely based on AI, or at least automate to the point where we can reduce the number of FTEs. And of course, the goal would be to be able to operate this on a shoestring of people, a very small skeleton crew where it doesn't require a lot of energy or resource to provision. So the expectation is great, right? We're sold this idea of what's going to work for us to make our jobs easier. And what we're then promised when we actually go to purchase, we're promised something that looks more like this. Is it perfect? No. Is it exactly what we had envisioned? No. But we do expect, because the vendor promises something that resembles more like this, right? It's been fully assembled and tested. We know that the use cases are already inbuilt. We're hoping, because the vendor told us that all of this would require as little effort as possible, and that everything could be done very simply with a single click, right? So I think the difference between what we expected and what we were promised have already been going to a point where we're limiting our expectations and reducing that because of what the vendor community has traditionally delivered. And to make matters worse, we expected something perfect. We were promised something realistic, but what we were delivered looks more like this, right? It's a hodgepodge of pieces and parts, especially if you're a larger organization that's been investing heavily in tools and processes over the last couple of years. You've staffed up full team of full stack developers to assemble and build out the use case and playbooks for you. And what we get delivered when the vendors finally unload on our pallet is a number of systems that don't always work well together. There's few, if any, pre-built interface or interconnections. It requires a ton of labor and man hours to assemble it all. And lastly, even when that's done, it's a very fragile and fraught with challenges interconnection, right? There's a number of discrete parts that if you don't get it all right, they fall apart very easily. This is how the problem has evolved over the course of the last several years. So let's think about this from the role of traditional tools, right? Everyone's asking, well, can this replace SIEM? Does XDR replace SOAR? Why are those tools, first of all, even on the table for replacement or displacement, because they largely haven't addressed all of the needs that the security community requires. SIM, at its original use case definition 2 decades ago, was really about satisfying the compliance and reporting demands, right? This is the idea that we needed a central log management platform. We needed to be able to generate report characteristic of compliance and governance demands, things like PCI or SOX. And only in the newer evolutions of SIM did threat detection start taking on a more active role. Now, it's been doing that quite well, but there are some challenges with doing it in the old school traditional way of SIMs. First of all, they're very complex to install. They're very difficult to onboard. The data management piece is a challenge all by itself. Getting to long-term ROI or a time to value, it has been a challenge as well, because of the amount of both CapEx and OpEx that required to invest in. It typically requires a number of people to manage and maintain. And lastly, because the rule definition is something that the content team or your own SecOps or detection engineering team has to manage, there's an opportunity or a chance for a number of false positives. So if you're constantly spending your time sifting through mounds of events, trying to find the right ones, you're going to have a challenge. Resha mentioned earlier the fact that it's all preserved in separate data silos. We'll talk more about that in a minute, but I can tell you from history, and I've probably stood up no fewer than 1,000 SIM deployments in my history. And I can tell you there's 2 schools of thought for how to do it. One is you onboard all the data sources up front. You get all the data into a central location like a central logging system, and then you figure out what to do with it later. This creates a tremendous load on both the platform as well as the detection engineering teams to understand and discern what those events mean and how to piece those events together in the appropriate order to affect proper correlation. The second school of thought is you pick a use case. Maybe that use case is brute force anomaly detection, or it's data exfiltration and C2 definition. If those are the use cases you choose, then you pick a use case, you understand what data sources are required to satisfy those use cases, you onboard those data sources, you build a correlation around that event stream alone, you verify that the resulting use case works, and then you rinse and repeat. So the idea is you've got 2 ways of doing it. You put all your data in one place and figure out what to do with it later, or you systematically and methodically determine what event stream you need to answer very specific use cases. You onboard those data sources, you verify those use case results, and then you move on. Now, a few years after SIMS, we came into the SOAR world, the security orchestration, automation, and response area. And the main use cases originally for SOAR were things like enriching data from secondary telemetry streams, things like threat intel. But of course, the idea behind orchestration automation is to improve the automated response capability, and more importantly, the consistency with which those actions were being taken by building and maintaining complex playbooks. So those use cases have maintained today, and going forward, you'll still see a number of more mature organizations investing in SOAR technology. But there are a couple of downsides to SOAR technology as well. First of all, it too, much like SIM, is incredibly complex, it's incredibly expensive, and it's very human dependent. While most SOARs offer things like low code or no code implementations, there's nothing out there that allows you to not know anything about the infrastructure and still hit a single button and have those playbooks work. So there's a hard onboarding process for SOARs. They are very expensive to build and maintain in the long run. So how does XDR differ? Well, first of all, the use cases are somewhat similar and overlap in some extent to SIM and SOAR, but it adds the advantage of having cross-stack visibility. Now, that's something that SIM does as well, but of course, it comes with the burden of infrastructure costs. It expands the capability of threat detection and hunting by leveraging more ML and AI. More importantly, threat detection and detection engineering takes place by the vendors that offer XDR, and you'll see this more and more going forward, is that it will be dependent upon and incumbent upon the vendor to bring the right content to the XDR detection engineering space. And then lastly, the response automation should be something that you should expect to be very simple and straightforward with either low code or no code implementations for automation, but it should also allow you to prescribe responses before taking them. Those actions should be simple and API driven, and they should not require extensive and very complex playbooking. So the benefits of XDR over SIM and SOAR, one is we get a place to consolidate the relevant telemetry. Not everything that gets generated is important, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, to prioritize those event sources that add the highest value to volume relationship. We are also maintaining that the analyst efficiency needs to improve, and the only way to do that is by reducing the number of and complexity of consoles that are required to implement to leverage these capabilities. The one-click and automated responses means we need to be able to allow for the system to take action on its own if prescribed by the system. But we can't forget that human-machine teaming, incorporating a human element into the cyber response plan, is still going to be a requirement for many organizations, regardless of size. And lastly, the idea that the ecosystem needs to be broad and deep enough to allow you to select still your best in breed security platforms that you've already made significant investments in, as well as the long tail of third-party technologies you need to integrate. And that can only be done by a vendor that has prioritized an open architecture with an open ecosystem. So let's now get into the 5 best practices. It's a great setup right now to understand kind of the market landscape, what's already out there, what's working, what's not working. Let's now talk about a couple of best practices in this space. And we'll start, Raisha, with this one. Go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. And I want to say that's such an important point you made about differences between SIEM, SOAR, and XDR, because I often hear confusion from prospects and customers on that point. So that was a great data that you added. So as XDR is gaining so much traction, and as you're kind of looking to implement that XDR journey, the first best practice you should ensure is that the XDR solution you choose helps you maximize the value of your existing investment. Michael, if you can go to the next slide. So let's be realistic. Most organizations have many tools and technologies deployed in their SOC, and it's not possible just to kind of simply decommission them and not use them with a hope of replacing it with some magic XDR solution from a single vendor. So the XDR solution that you're looking at should be unifying and simplifying your entire security stack. And what that means is that a security stack, which will be, usually consisting of numerous functionalities or numerous solutions like SIEM, EDR, NDR, email security, and so forth. So the XDR you choose should allow you to make use of those existing tools, connect them maybe through built-in integrations or some sort of other mechanism, ultimately offering the customers and ultimately offering you the flexibility you need without limiting them to a particular platform, because that's not really budget friendly or realistic at one point. Michael, do you have any thoughts on that?
I think it's also important to point out that no one vendor will be best in breed in all of these areas. No one vendor, we believe, will have the right answer for every one of these technology solutions. And even if you did find that one vendor that claims to have it all, do you really trust putting all your eggs in one basket, right? I think it's important to know that you've made very specific technology decisions for your organization based upon the capabilities and functionality of certain technology stacks across the vendor community. We're not saying that you should expect to displace or replace those and look to consolidate to a single vendor. That's not the goal of XDR. XDR is about allowing you to leverage the tools and platforms you've already invested in, the people and resources that are already trained to use those tools, and integrate those as much as possible. But to the extent where you can leverage one vendor to bring you more than one best in breed solution into the XDR stack, you can expect better integration, both at the data ingestion and telemetry level to the XDR response areas, if that single vendor can bring more to bear. So we think about it, and the analyst community has broken these down into native XDR versus open XDR. Our argument is why pick only one? We think native and open should be the way that most XDR deployments are perceived going forward.
Yeah, and then the second best practice that we believe is you should be leveraging a solid EDR foundation for an XDR solution. So if you look at it, most effective XDR solutions should be based in EDR, because if you don't start with EDR, you don't really have an extended detection and remediation. So for example, most attacks start on an endpoint. Endpoints are involved in pretty much every stage of an attack. adversaries exploit an endpoint, they gain access, they escalate privileges, move laterally through the network, and so forth, all through exploiting an endpoint. I can go on, but you get the picture, right? So basically, endpoint provides unique window and a unique view into what's happening at every stage of the attack. So a best-in-class XDR should build on that really great, enormous value prop that EDR brings and extend it from the endpoint to other sources, other telemetry sources such as cloud security solutions, mobile, identity, network, and what have you. And because XDR is built to cover all endpoints and deliver a single actionable pane of glass, if you will. I know, Michael, you just talked about that, along with centralized response functionality. It really saves SOC, time spent on connecting the dots manually to get the complete picture and then respond to contain the alerts quickly, alerts that might have otherwise been missed and caused critical damage. So this just, kind of shows like everything that you do on EDR on an endpoint, you can take that same awesomeness and extend it to other sources.
We'll talk more later too about the data, the volume of data, and the value of the telemetry generated by various platforms. EDR to this day still has, hands down, the highest fidelity detection rate and, more importantly, telemetry generation. So if you're going to base your XDR on something, the value of EDR data is second to none. We'll talk more about that in a minute. Okay, so let me take this one, Resha. So best practice number 3 is really understanding that security is a data problem, and the only way to solve a data problem is by having sufficient compute resource behind the data management solution to ensure that you can handle both the volume, the scale, the scope of the challenge that XDR is set out to solve. So let's look at this a little bit in terms of there we go. I think I stalled for a minute. So if you realize and believe that security is a data problem, let's think about the silos that we've been creating in security operations for the last couple of decades, right? I mentioned earlier that EDR data, endpoint data, has largely been consumed into a single data silo. Now, if you think about the SIEM space in the middle, right? SIEM was always meant to consume all of the third-party telemetry that was not endpoint. Why not endpoint? Because endpoint data is so voluminous. There's so much volume to that data. Even though the fidelity is very high, there's also a tremendous volume of it. So most SIEMs were never built to handle the type of ingestion, storage, and search conditions of endpoint telemetry. Imagine every one of your Windows event hosts, every one of your Linux systems, every one of your Mac or mobile devices sending every bit of telemetry into your SIEM, whether it's a cloud SIEM or an on-prem SIEM. You can quickly see how that would be overwhelming to those platforms. And lastly, in recent years, we've added a third data silo that we had never predicted in the past, and that's the one of cloud. Cloud is by itself its own data silo. Many times it's because the cloud vendors have made it incredibly cost prohibitive to remove data from their cloud instances and move it into your SIEM or log management platform. So it's important that we understand that we have to work with and within these boundaries of multiple silos. Now, I'm also of the opinion that you should have the ability to democratize your data. And that is that no one application in your enterprise should hold your data hostage. And right now, we see that multiple copies of data are being made in many locations. You might consume it once for compliance and send it across into another tool for analytics and feed it off into something else for response. Your SOC analyst might use a different tool than your IT team. And so it's important to know that these separate silos really create a unique problem in security. In fact, as Resha mentioned earlier, ESG claimed in their last study that 2/3 of customers claim that as long as you keep your data in separate silos, you are guaranteed to miss detections. She also made a good point about the fact that many events and alerts are never triaged, and that's a huge problem. And again, it's a data problem, it's a data volume problem to solve. Now, to solve this problem, you should really be thinking about 3 separate but very related things, and that is what we call the golden triangle. Right? And the golden triangle is this idea that you need all three of these, and it's incredibly difficult for any one platform to deliver all three at the same time. First, you need incredibly high performance. That is, we can't be sitting there waiting for the results of a query when we're doing a threat hunt. If we're trying to do a remediation and reduce the mean time to respond, we certainly can't wait 5-10 minutes for queries to come back, because your data backend simply can't stand up to the performance and load put upon it by the volume of data you're feeding it or the level of compute you're able to assign it. So performance is one of those key characteristics that should be measured. From a measurement perspective, we think about the time it takes to respond to triage or threat hunting queries, the time it takes us to remediate activities. And we should be thinking about it in terms of sub-second response times. We measure platform technologies by how quickly the response comes back from the query. And we like to hold our hat to the fact that 96% of the queries performed in our backend platform can be completed in under a second. Now that's an incredibly high goal to maintain, but we're maintaining that as we speak. Scale is the other important thing. When you think about the volume of data from any one of these silos, let alone all three combined, scale has to be one of the important considerations to think about. When we're thinking about consuming petabytes of data a day, storing that data in a retention pool for 90 days is one thing, but when you need to consume and store that data for 365 days, scale becomes even more important. And lastly, you can't choose to incorporate a highly performant, highly scalable platform without taking into consideration the cost of doing so. From a vendor perspective, there's a COGS that typically get rolled off to the customer. So it's important to know that the vendor you choose has to have solved that golden triangle problem. To build the backend data management platform or a data lake that handles the scale, the scope, and the performance requirements, and still preserve the cost benefit analysis that we all expect when we start consuming and purchasing these technologies. So to solve these data problems, you really need a platform that can handle both the data ingest at high rates, the data retention for long periods of time, the performance from a compute perspective to return those result sets fast, and more importantly, the ability to do that in a cost-effective manner.
Yeah, I think, the combination of like high volume, high fidelity EDR data, along with those combined with data from other apps and other sources, is crucial to get that complete picture across your security estate, and then having a scalable, cost affordable data management solution is absolutely needed.
That's a great point. Okay, so number 4, it's important that we align the outcomes, or we align what we're looking for in XDR to those business objectives and outcomes. And that's important because there are going to be many stakeholders across the organization that are going to see value in XDR if it's done right. And the important thing is, let's break this down by persona. So the first one we look at, and we always think about, is the C-suite, right? Who's the one who would see this as a huge advantage to them in terms of being able to report better KPIs up to the board? So the security officer, the CISO, the chief information officer, these are people that are looking to maintain one thing, and most importantly, business continuity, right? They want to make sure that nothing they do will impede or impact the ability to generate revenue or deliver service. So business continuity and resilience is probably one of the most important things that they're concerned about. They also, of course, want to make sure that they don't end up on the cover of the Wall Street Journal as the latest breach. But it's also important to know that even though they may not get into the minutia of how it's done, they do understand that reducing the mean time to detect and mean time to respond, reducing the dwell time is probably one of the most important metrics, because the longer an adversary has to play around in your environment, the longer he has to affect things like privilege escalation, lateral movement, entrenchment. So the ability for us to detect those sooner and respond quicker also helps to maintain that first objective of business continuity. And lastly, of course, the best way to do that is to evaluate and reduce the attack surface, whether that's done through vulnerability assessment platforms, it's done through benchmarking like CIS or STIGs, whether it's done through hardening of platforms, or making sure that the entitlements that we're issuing to our users and our service and applications are not overly extensive. That's the other claim that CISOs are probably looking for out of XDR. Now let's pivot and put on a different hat for a minute and think about the IT operations or SecOps, security operations team. Many of you may say, well, we don't have a SOC, but we do have a security operations function, or it's rolled into the same IT team. So it's important to understand that it's not just the very mature organizations that are looking at XDR. Even the smaller organizations that have a 1 or 2 man team that they call security operations is also relevant to them. And to them, of course, they're looking at things that are a little more tactical, right? They're looking at understanding the impact of ransomware and how to minimize both the ability for ransomware to take hold or the response time that we can affect ransomware response. So the impact of ransomware is incredibly important across the personas. But they're also interested in making sure that their complexity is being reduced. We mentioned the alert fatigue, which is a real thing. We know that it's also difficult to maintain that many consoles, and the learning curve for those many consoles is steep. So the complexity needs to drop in order to us to improve the security posture throughout the enterprise. We need to improve the efficiency that SecOps teams can perform their tasks. And a lot of that has to do with orchestration and automation. A lot of that has to do with integrations through the ecosystem. A lot of that has to do with improving the workflows from both detection to response, and that's what XDR is all about. The visibility and context is also important to understand from a SecOps perspective. Is understanding and getting as much value out of the data and telemetry stream as possible. In the military world, it's called situational awareness, having the right data at the right time to make the right decision. And that's really what XDR is meant to deliver, right? Is a single location or a centralized facility to allow you to have visibility to those high priority event streams and telemetry sources to make the best informed decision at the right time. And then lastly, we need to up-level our security analyst skill set. Right now, you might have to hire somebody that just manages the IDS, IPS, and firewall, and somebody else to do cloud security, and somebody else to do your endpoint tech stack. The idea is to reduce the amount of effort that any one SOC analyst needs to perform on a single console or to learn proficiency across multiple consoles, and allow them to up-level their skills. No analyst wants to sit there mining through data manually through the triage and investigation or the scoping process. To the extent where we can consolidate that into a single workflow or work stream and perform many of those steps using AI, right? The ability for us to reduce and align the event stream into a single context and flow, and you'll see that a little bit going forward. And then lastly, we've got the security engineer, the person who's responsible for selecting and deploying those tools. He also has a complexity challenge. She also needs to decide how many different consoles they can afford to deploy and learn. We need to deploy fewer consoles with higher skills or reduced skill set to learn each console. And lastly, all of the teams have to be aware that if we're employing tools that are adding more friction to the enterprise, people will find ways to not use them, right? We need to make sure that whatever we do is seamless and frictionless. We need to make sure that we're not adding more layers to the security onion, but more importantly, making sure that the tools we're adding are adding more value without impeding traditional business process. Reshni, you want to add anything?
Yeah, I think these are really great outcomes. Couple I would also like to add is first is, rapid time to value. So a lot of the solutions have out of the box integrations with other tools across different, product stack. And this kind of enables you to rapidly maximize value from your existing investment. And just to add to that, also helps you reduce cost of your ownership. So budgeting is always a big concern with the security team, and making sure that you keep that budget low, use your existing stack really helps with that.
That's a good point. I didn't mention that in all these, but many of these end up being a reduction of cost as well, both CapEx and OpEx. The fewer tools, the fewer FTE, the improved response time, like all of those things add efficiency and cost advantages. So while I didn't explicitly call out the dollar signs in all of these, it's inherent in the XDR technology stack. And then lastly, let's talk about how we prioritize which are the right integrations that make sense. And to do so, we need to think of it in two ways. One is how much volume of data and what value that represents to ingest into an environment or a single data lake to make these detections more effective. And lastly, how do we prioritize the response actions that make the most sense for my organization? To do so, let's keep in mind that all data are not equal, right? And it's important that we understand that there's a key relationship between the volume of data and the value it represents to a security operations team. And we need to understand that as we think about onboarding the data sources. So for instance, if I were to break down data source to volume, the one that many people look at is cloud security now. So in a CloudTrail event stream, about 99+% of the event stream in CloudTrail is completely irrelevant to the security team. Things like read events, which have no modification characteristics, represent the highest volume of data in a CloudTrail stream. And yet the value that that represents is incredibly low to SecOps. Not to say that there's no value in it from an observability and an operations perspective, but from a security perspective, there's very little value. Same goes for things like RDS events that are generated between system level transactions. Very high volume of transaction, but very low volume or value. Compare that to the less than 0.5% of the event stream that are the write events or the modify events in CloudTrail. These are the disable, delete, and schedule key. Those are incredibly low in volume, but offer incredibly high value for doing detection engineering. So it's important to understand that consuming all of the data is not as helpful as consuming the right data. It's also understandable that just-in-time data collection can also be used, so we're not having to stream the entire bulk data traffic into a platform, but using the advantage of knowing who we're monitoring over what time periods, and more importantly, when we see suspicious activity associated with them in another area of the network, whether that's their endpoint, their identity suite, their mobile device, that at that point, we can then start consuming the relevant data from these cloud data sources. The same is true, by the way, for identity. We made an investment recently, and we purchased a company in the identity space specifically because we know that identity is one of those new sources for us. It's a new sentinel, it's a new surface that will add tremendous value to what is already being done on the endpoint. And for that, we look at the same value to volume relationship. Kerberos ticket expirations, for anybody that sat there looking through your WMI logs in any volume, you know that those things happen all the time. And they happen with such high volume that they drown out some of the more important telemetry and source events that are important for us to observe and monitor. So Kerberos ticket events, incredibly high with a very low value. Authentication success can be of moderate value if we're looking for things like privilege escalation or service account usage, but it occurs at such a high rate as well that sometimes those can get cloudy in the mix of relevant events. But if we look at things like auth failures, those should occur at such a low rate and offer moderate to high value that those are incredibly important for us to monitor, because it's the use of both success and failure event streams that let us do things like the last one, which is the privilege or the password spraying or brute force. These don't happen very often, but when they do, the value of that telemetry and detection is incredibly high. It's very actionable to know that if I see a brute force login transaction, that is multiple failed login attempts over a short period of time, followed by a successful, or the attempt to invade based on password spraying. The identity technology is also important to understand things like credential harvesting, as well as password misuse of service accounts. So it's important to know that identity logs offer tremendous value if done properly. If we consume the right telemetry stream and ignore the stuff that is largely less helpful. In fact, it's probably safe to say that the value to volume relationship decreases the higher the volume goes. So the efficacy and speed of threat hunting can actually be the reverse of from a proportionality perspective to the size and scope of data. That is, if I think I can learn more by ingesting more, I'm just wrong. More data does not necessarily mean better detections, does not mean more visibility. In fact, more data in many cases means cloudy visibility, and the ability for a platform like an XDR tool to quickly and effectively monitor the telemetry stream, picking out what's important and adding it to the analyst dashboard. That's what becomes incredibly important from an XDR data perspective. Risha?
No, I think it's very well said, Michael. And I think as you're looking to prioritize the different data ingestion sources, different integrations, you should look at, another point of view is you should also look at the top attack vectors, which can get in the organization and prioritize accordingly. Absolutely.
Great point. So let's bring it around to what SentinelOne has done, and that is that we've built what's now called the Singularity XDR platform. We mentioned native and open earlier, and the important thing is that's how we define our ingestion data sources, right? We started with an endpoint stack that was second to none, EDR. We extended into mobile, network through our Ranger product, cloud, both container security as well as cloud workload, and of course recently with the intent to acquire Attivo, the identity component. The open architecture for us is through our marketplace, our ecosystem, which we've been building on for the last 2 years. The ability for us to onboard new data sources that are not native to us, but offer simple integrations with a simple API policy. The ability for us to then consume all of that data, feed it into our native data lake, and more importantly, align what we call our storyline technology, which is our ability to piece together the breadcrumbs of a transaction, looking at the behavioral characteristics of the attacker, understanding when specific events match specific MITRE techniques, aligning those into an attack stream, and then putting those all together in a single user experience. In fact, we were able to, in the last year MITRE results, go from, what was it, 170 detections down to 7 event streams. Was that about right, Resha?
That is correct.
So the ability for us to say that an analyst only has to look at 7 important things that are now part and parcel all of the attack vectors and behaviors that were observed by the attacker. We align those all against MITRE, and then lastly, we allow them for singular remediation. That is, a single-click remediation will remove all of the adversarial behaviors. And then lastly, the response piece. How do we then leverage what we've learned and what we've already ingested on the data side to affect an informed response? Now, that response can be against our native technology stacks, that is, things that are native to the endpoint or cloud, things like quarantine or rollback, things like remote script orchestration to allow us to reach out and perform actions on the endpoint itself. But XDR is all about extending beyond endpoint. And so XDR also allows us to leverage the same marketplace and ecosystem integrations to not just ingest data, but also to perform response actions. Those actions can be prescribed or taken automatically on behalf of the SOC analyst and the investigation. Those third-party integrations will leverage the same API connections we've built into our marketplace and allow you to then chain those together to make sure we can build non-playbook-based response orchestration. And lastly, it's don't just take our word for it, right? We've also been recognized as the industry leader in a number of categories. First of all, Gartner has named us a leader last 2 years. Our last round of MITRE, the one before the one being announced tomorrow, by the way, which we'll mention again in a little bit, we were the only vendor to have 100% visibility, no missed detections, no delays. We required no configuration changes. That is, we didn't have to go back and say, let us tweak the policy because we didn't get it the first time, give us a second chance. That wasn't a requirement at all. We have over 6,000 customers, and that number grows on a daily basis. We operate out of 80 or more countries. But I think the most important characteristic and number here are the number of satisfied customers. Those customers give us a 95% satisfaction. We have 97% renewal rate. And what's also important to know is that our partners in the IR, MSSP, and MSP and MDR space trust us so well that these are the brands that we have brought on in the last 2 years. These represent a huge percentage of our business. In fact, 80% of all customers that align to us or that leverage our technology through an IR engagement eventually become SentinelOne customers. People love working here, as the Glassdoor indicates. And lastly, the peer insights. We have the highest rating across all of the EDR vendors. Lastly, we know that last year we also had an incredibly successful IPO. We listed on the New York Stock Exchange. We were listed as the largest IPO, cybersecurity IPO in history, and we still continue to maintain that status going forward. Anything you want to add, Resha?
No, I think all great points. I just wanted to remind people again, which you just alluded to, Michael, that the MITRE results are dropping tomorrow. This is the Wizard Spider and the Sandworm evaluations, and we are having a webinar just on the day of results, mostly about how you can operationalize MITRE, use it in your security operations to better it. So please join us. It will be very interesting. Also, there are lots of questions, Michael. Maybe, I started answering a few of them, and then thought maybe we can just take it live on the webinar. So first one is, can your XDR replace my SIM? So I'm thinking that it depends on, what you're using for a SIM for. There are certain use cases like compliance and, like you want to store data for that sort of use cases where you might want to use your SIM for. But for threat detection, general remediation, XDR can definitely, offer a lot of functionality that your SIM does.
My first question to that would be, do you already have all of the telemetry you need in your SIM, or are you continuing to invest and double down on your investment in SIM? If your SIM can't currently consume and realize the advantage of all of the telemetry streams you now need in a modern day enterprise, then maybe SIM technology is not the right one for you. If you're spending too much time investing in detection engineering and validating your correlation rules, then maybe that's a burden that you might not want to continue investing in. Does XDR replace every SIM use case? No, not yet. And I would challenge any vendor that claims it can. There are those enterprises out there that have invested heavily in SIM architectures and technology, and they will continue to invest going forward. But again, for those organizations that might struggle at maintaining the advantage of or the ROI of SIM, I think XDR is a solid alternative in the coming years.
Yep. So the second question is, are integrations with new SaaS SIM on the roadmap? So we really have currently we have robust kind of integration with a lot of SIM players, and we continually add more every quarter. So definitely stay tuned. If you go to the marketplace page on our website, you will find the current integrations there. The other question is, does your XDR align with MITRE and have SOAR functionality? I want to say, like, MITRE is so woven into our product, whether you're doing any detections using the MITRE TTPs, whether you're trying to do threat hunting, and definitely our XDR platform also utilizes that. Michael, do you want to talk about SOAR functionality?
Yeah, so I would say this. We have integrations with existing SOAR. So for those vendors who've already made investments in things like Phantom or Demisto or SERP or other SOAR architectures, there's no reason you can't continue to use them. But to our point earlier that SOARs tend to be a bit complex, cumbersome, and expensive, if you haven't invested yet in SOAR, I would challenge that you might benefit from thinking about what use cases you would want to implement and whether or not those use cases require complex multi-stage playbooks. If not, if they can be affected by leveraging very simple integrations, things like, I know when this event occurs, I need to force users back through two-factor authentication. I need to invalidate user authentication tokens and make them re-log in. I need to have a dynamic response that says that this user can no longer connect to, let's say, high-value assets. So I think those simple response actions can be affected very, very easily with an XDR and don't require complex multi-stage playbooking like a SOAR does. So will we work with SOARs? Absolutely. Will SOAR functionality be built into SentinelOne XDR? Yes, to a great extent it already is. The orchestration and automation pieces are there. The difference is it does not require or even support, that's true, very large multi-stage playbooking.
And I also want to add to that is with our storyline active response, this is our star functionality. You can do a lot of if this, then that sort of logic, which has a very SOAR-like functionality.
In fact, in our first XDR demos that we're providing now, many of them are built specifically on the functionality of storyline active response. And to Raish's point, you build out, much like you do in a SIM, you build out a rule that says, if I see this and this and this, then the response should be that. And that response can very easily now be integrations with our XDR marketplace partners. So I urge you to take a look at the marketplace integration pieces that are listed on our website. Look for the vendors that you're currently using in best of breed deployments. And if it's not there, let us know, because we're probably actively working on a simple one-click integration for that product as well.
Yep. So next question is SentinelOne looking to get FedRAMP for compliance? We're already currently FedRAMP medium, so I think we're good there. Any thoughts of integrating DLP functions in the future? I think there are a couple of use cases that we're actively talking about for DLP, but stay tuned for more functionality as you know, as we look into next quarter. Will there be recording? Yes, absolutely. Recording will be provided. I think slides are not provided, but the recording, including the presentation that you see, will be there. What else? If would be interesting to know if you have any plans adding IoT discovery to Singularity Console. So we have actually a product called Ranger, which does device discovery through passive kind of fingerprinting to see what devices are there in your network and what can take a SentinelOne agent. That's currently there. If you're interested, happy to give you guys more overview. It's also available on our website with under Singularity Ranger.
It's important to note too about Ranger, it's not just about discovery, it's also about protection. So we all know that IoT devices can be a new current attack vector that certain adversaries might leverage, coming in and hitting things like Honeywell HVAC controllers or camera systems that may live both on the enterprise and now, you know, in our homes, which also have direct access to our corporate assets sometimes. So the important thing about Ranger is it not only provides the discovery of those assets to allow you to understand what lives in your network that you may not know about already, and as Resha mentioned, what can take an active agent that we might be able to deploy on, but it also the capability of allowing us to block communication from those unmanaged devices. It can say, if anything that doesn't have an agent on it tries talking to us, we can provide firewall rules that say that no communication can occur between an unmanaged asset like an IoT device and a corporate asset that has an agent running on it.
Yeah. Well said. A lot of questions. I'm trying to go through this quickly. Will SentinelOne announce major partnerships with one of the big three cloud platforms? We already currently have partnership with AWS and GCP, and so I think there is more information available if you want. Is rogue device detection included in any of your product? Yes, our Singularity Ranger takes care of rogue device detection and also protection, like Michael talked about. Does Ranger protect only by allowing one to isolate the IoT devices? No, again, this goes back to what Michael said. Not only we detected, we also protected. Best, okay. How can, let's see, how can we get in touch with the salesperson? I don't have, okay. To everybody else who wants to get in touch with us, with this recording, we'll also send more details on how to get access to the sales team and you know, any information you need. Do you have firewall integration with major vendors like Fortinet? I don't believe so currently at the moment, though some of them are in the roadmap. Like Michael mentioned, if there are specific firewall vendors that you're working with and are interested in integrating with our solution, definitely reach out to us. Happy to you know, work on that. On the service provider offerings, one of the main challenges for XDR platform is the lack of cross-tenant visibility. How do you solve or plan to solve this? Do you want to take this, Michael?
Yeah, so I think it's a really important point, and that is, you know, it's important to know that our platform was built from the ground up in a cloud-native multi-tenant capability. That is, that our MSSPs are currently, and our IR and MDR partners currently leverage our existing technology, which is already multi-tenant. Now, what that means is that an MSSP has the ability on the back end to see across various tenants. What we are also important to note that it's from a data management perspective and a data segregation perspective, those data streams need to remain separate. So even if an MSSP is servicing multiple tenant customers, that data cannot be commingled for a number of governance reasons. And more importantly, GDPR has very strict requirements about residency as well. So while MSSPs can currently leverage our technology in their own multi-tenant, in our hosted multi-tenant capacity, they do have the ability to take the logic and the domain expertise that they bring and align it across multiple tenants. That is, if they build a detection engine rule using STAR, they can actually leverage that STAR rule across multiple tenants by simply cloning that rule and leveraging it across multiple customers. So the ability to leverage content is already there. The ability to leverage detection rules is through a cloning process that allows them to extend the capability to all of the tenants they serve.
Trying to sift through other questions. Again, Michael, if you want to take this one, you mentioned early in the session, single pane of glass with mobile product ever get integrated within this XDR console?
Absolutely, it will. Our intent all along with our mobile platform was to be able to unify those consoles into a single interface. We decided for the purposes of getting a product to market quickly, we would go out to market with a two console solution. We know that the people that manage the mobile platform are probably a very different set of people than manage the EDR platform. So for larger organizations, those are already bifurcated roles. And so they're probably the separate consoles is not a problem. But the goal obviously is to integrate our mobile threat detection platform directly into our EDR console so that you can visualize all of the device elements, the telemetry streams, and the rules all inside the single platform. That's coming later this year.
Yeah, great. Do you have a list of MDR partners you integrate with? Yes, I think we or IR, MDR, and MSSP partner over all major players. There's a list, I think, on our website. Happy to send it to you guys with the recording that will be sent over. I know you're partnered with Enable for EDR, but are you partnered with them for XDR? So actually, we are partnered with Enable for XDR. Endpoint detection and response is strictly native on our side. I think we're almost on the top of the hour. If there are any other questions that are not answered, we will definitely make sure to get them answered. Adam, I'm going to turn it back to you. Thank you guys so much. It was really, really great talking to all of you and getting all the questions.
Yeah, very helpful. It was so interactive. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Raisha and Michael. That was outstanding. I'm gonna have everybody take the chat and the questions. Notes are going to be saved down, and we'll have somebody follow up with people afterward. Thanks a lot, everybody. We're going to wrap things up, and we will see you later.